Fight Back Together. That was the banner under which thousands of union members gathered in centres across the country today to oppose what they described as the government's attacks on workers' rights.
Union! Union!
We are the working class!
We are the working class!
With the head of the shout, it's out, and the rise of the factories fall.
This government is delivering for all workers, including the over 85% who are not union members.
Brooke Van Velden's cut and paste contractors law reform bill appears to have been written largely by Uber lobbyists.
I say what I think, that the company stinks. Yes, I'm a union man.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detail today, unions, they are still vocal, but are they still relevant? In these days of rising unemployment, are memberships on the up or continuing their downward slide? And why won't the Minister in charge of Workplace Relations and Safety meet with the country's biggest trade union? What's really going on?
Out of sight and out of mind is what she's trying to get.
You going to shut up and go away?
Yeah, of course not.
That's Richard Wagstaff, President of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, or CTU, our largest democratic organisation representing about 360,000 workers. He's used to being in the offices of workplace ministers of all stripes, so why hasn't he caught up with Minister Brooke Van Velden since their one, and turns out only, meeting back in November 2023?
First thing we said to her was, good that you're meeting with us. Can we set up a regular meeting? Thinking that was pretty uncontroversial, given that that's been the pattern with people in her role for decades. And she actually said no. She couldn't confirm a regular meeting date. And since then, we've asked to meet her half a dozen or more times. I've lost count and given up, really, because every time she says no. The only other time she met with us was when we brought 150 health and safety reps to Parliament, to the Beehive, and implored her to turn up and front up to them, and she did. But that wasn't a straight-up meeting with us. This is despite numerous issues coming through her office relating to working people and their rights, like fair pay agreements, 90-day trials, Holidays Act, minimum wages, contractor law reform, personal grievances, pay equity, and so on and so forth. There's been a lot of decisions she's taken or not taken, a lot of things that are very important to us, and we're pretty astounded that she hasn't taken the time to actually get the voice of working people in her considerations. We don't have to agree on everything, but we should have respect for each other's views and understand them and try to find consensus. That's kind of what I would consider good government. That's what we've had in the past. We certainly did work with Michael Woodhouse, a previous National Party Minister of Workplace Relations. We worked on 0 hours with him very effectively. We worked on some of the Holidays Act issues very effectively. And sure, we made some changes that we didn't like, but at least he was prepared to listen to our point of view and hear it.
What do you think the problem is, the issue she has?
Well, I guess from the get-go, the government appointed an inexperienced ACT minister, to be in this portfolio, which sent a pretty strong signal, I think. And let's face it, ACT doesn't have a strong record when it comes to unions and workers' rights. I think that she just thinks that it's not her job to meet with people. I might add that the Prime Minister nor the Minister of Finance will meet with us either, which again is unprecedented. But I guess the point is she doesn't want to hear our view. She has a different view. She knows she has a different view. Pretty well on every issue I can think of, she's taken a view that for us is pro-employer and anti-worker, and she knows that that's likely to continue. There seems to be a feeling that out of sight and out of mind is what she's trying to get.
Are you going to shut up and go away?
Yeah, of course not. We have a duty to working people to express their views, and we have a duty to working people to make it clear that what she's doing is not helping us one little bit. The removal of fair pay agreements, for example, these are for bus drivers, for cleaners, for supermarket workers, for security workers and so on. These are vulnerable people who held this country together through the pandemic, through COVID. Everyone was singing their praises about how essential they are and how valuable they are. But the minute we had a change of government, we removed their bargaining rights for industry standards, which was a disaster for them, in my view.
But she is meeting with alternate unions. What's your take on this?
Well, it's a nonsense, isn't it? She says that we only represent, she says 15% of the workforce. It's a lot more than that. But even then she's found that, and so therefore why bother? But even then she's found the time to meet with the Free Speech Union, a libertarian organisation, and a couple of so-called red-based unions based in Australia, which the ACTU is called fake unions because they're associated with anti-vaxxing and the Liberal Party there. They're clearly, their purpose is to undermine legitimate and established unions. And she's taken the time to meet with them. So I think that sort of just says a lot. Her actions speak louder than words.
Here's the Minister responding to the Labour Party's Camilla Ballich about unions during question time in Parliament in October last year.
To the Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, does she agree with the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions that this is the most anti-worker government that we've seen in decades? If not, why not?
The Honourable Brooke Van Velden.
Mr. Speaker, no, I don't agree with that statement because I believe, in fact, the most anti-worker government we've seen in decades is the previous government. It was the previous government that ordered vaccine mandates for workers. Never before have we seen the rights of workers across this country be eroded so swiftly. Not only did this erode workers' freedom of choice and bodily autonomy, so many people were forced out of their jobs because the government refused to look at other options like rat tests. Rather than listen to those affected workers, the previous government pushed them to the margins of society. This government is delivering for all workers, including the over 85% who are not union members.
Who should New Zealanders believe? The Minister who says this government is trying to make life easier for workers, or the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions President, Richard Wagstaff, who said that this government has launched an all-out assault on workers' rights?
Mr. Speaker, they should believe this government.
Do you think because you're so Labour-aligned that could be an issue with why she doesn't want to meet with you?
Well, it's definitely a political kind of basis that she won't meet with us. I mean, so Labour-aligned, the CTU and the majority of our affiliates have no affiliation to the Labour Party or any political party. But sure, Labour does have its origins in the Labour movement, and there is a sense that working people need to do well. But I think this idea that working people have to do well, therefore business can't, is foolhardy, and I wonder whether that's where she comes from. She thinks it's a zero-sum game, when our view is that, in fact, we can all do well. If we look at the Scandinavians, we look at the Singaporeans and so forth, there's a real place there for the nation to thrive, both employers and workers. It's not a zero-sum game, but I wonder if that's her agenda.
Would you like to see her replaced? If you think if another minister came in, things would improve for you guys?
Well, I don't know what goes on around the cabinet table and whether she's taking instructions and I don't want to overly personalise it, but all I would say is that the minister we've had in this government, I don't know whether a change of minister would make much difference, but we do need, it seems to me, a government who understands that they have a fundamental and basic democratic sort of obligations, and one of them is meeting with trade unions and meeting with other groups like business too. We know they're doing that, but they need to take some balanced feedback before they make laws and make decisions that have, a huge impact on working people.
Realistically, when do you think you will meet with her next?
I really have no idea. There's no indication that she wants to meet with us again. I'm not holding my breath.
Business reporter Alice Peacock broke the story for newsroom.co.nz and says the lack of interaction between the government and CTU is definitely not the norm.
Prior to Brooke Van Velden's time in the role, in recent history anyway, the CTU, as the umbrella union, would meet with the minister monthly or at the very least quarterly, no matter the political stance of the government. So in preparation for this chat, I actually spoke to a former National MP who looked after this area during John Key's term, and he had confirmed that he would meet with CTU officials every 4 weeks. He said this would be for a good hour or so, and he described this as a platform for meaningful engagement. He suggested that the current minister's level of face-to-face engagement with union officials could be unhelpful to the relationship in general, and says that even if there are differences of opinion, it's important to have these discussions. He did, however, point out that when he took on the role, it was a different backdrop to that of Brooke Van Velden, and he suggested that the issues that she's had to engage with, and I guess the situation around labour laws, is maybe crunchier. He also said that there is, in general, from his perspective, a lower level of trust from unions in a national-led government, and she suggested that this would still be the case with the coalition government.
Alice contacted the Minister's office for official answers as to why Van Velden won't meet with the major unions.
When Newsroom asked her for a response to these criticisms, the Minister said that she cannot accept every invitation. She also said that she considers requests case by case and will arrange meetings when there is good reason to, with a clear and productive agenda. So as far as I know, there's no legislation that dictates the frequency of these meetings. But it is important to note that there's an expectation to consult with relevant or affected parties. There has been some criticism of this government, and that's not just from commentators and academics, but also from the government's own official advice from its ministries in regards to the lack of consultation in regard to lawmaking.
What I find so interesting, Alice, is that she's met with these alternative unions. What can you tell me about these groups and also their relevance?
So, Brooke Van Velden's ministerial diary, which is publicly available, shows that she has met with what have been called alternative unions. So, she's met with the Free Speech Union, as well as RNZ Unions, which is a sister network to the Australian Red Union network. And that one has ties to the anti-vax movement. So, this Red Union network set up in Australia just before the pandemic, and it was advertising itself as a cheaper alternative to traditional trade unions. So this is even though they're not actually registered unions under Australia's Fair Work Act. This means they legally don't have the same powers to represent workers. They were accused of capitalising on anti-vaccination fears to recruit doctors, teachers and nurses, and to exploit conflict within the labour movement about mandatory vaccinations. So the NZ Union group here has the same structure as the Red Union network. However, here they are in fact registered as unions. Based on their latest financial statements, so back in 2023, the company's register shows that all three of these groups, have relatively small memberships, so 205 for the nurses and just 15 for the teachers.
Now, interesting, you've seen some emails. This is from an OIA between the Minister's private secretary and one of her ministerial advisors. What did this reveal?
Yes, so these emails, which were released under the Official Information Act, included links to Stuff articles, which made the connection between NZ unions and its Australian counterparts. This is interesting because it shows that Van Velden's team, and presumably therefore her, knew about the origins of these organisations before she met with them.
What are the optics on this, Alice? Is this a bad look for the Minister to only see these little ones and avoid the big ones?
Most of the people that I've spoken to in this space have suggested that given the reputation of the groups, kind of paired with the skint amount of face time that she's given New Zealand's traditional unions, it is not a great look for the Minister.
What about the Minister herself? What has she had to say on this?
So when asked for her reaction to the criticism, Minister Van Velden has said that her preference is to hear directly from Kiwi workers and businesses.
As part of the government, I have the mandate to make sure that we are backing business so that business has confidence to go on and employ more people with better jobs.
And has also pointed out the high percentage of New Zealand's labour force who are not union members.
I do think it's important for us to listen to a range of perspectives. The CTU doesn't represent all workers.
She said that the best use of time for everyone is for unions to have their say through the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, then for MB to pass this on by way of policy advice. She has claimed that this has proved valuable to her over her first year in the role.
Now, how important, though, Alice, is it that there is a good relationship between the Minister and the unions?
So I think most people would agree that it's important. It's interesting to note that union membership in New Zealand has actually fallen over the past few decades, and according to MB, total union membership as of the 1st of March 2023 made up just under 10.5% of the labour force. However, they represent New Zealand's workers and they act as a middleman to communicate the concerns of employees to the government and to secure better working conditions. Regardless of the actual union membership, the changes that they secure for workers often actually impact a larger proportion of the given industry than just the membership, the union membership that is. I'd also point out that this comes at a time where many workers are struggling with the cost of living and also uncertainty around job stability and their rights.
Union power! Union power!
What is it about unions that makes them still relevant in the workplace today.
They need to be seen to be doing something, anything. This was a move by the unions to make the unions look like they might be worth paying your sub to.
Are unions still relevant today?
In spite of declining union membership, most people that I've spoken to seem to think that unions are very much still relevant. Labour laws in New Zealand have strengthened a lot in recent history, which has largely been driven by these union groups and industrial action. It's possible that we're at a point where, because labour laws are stronger, people think that there's less value in these groups. However, the counter-argument to this is that these stronger labour laws aren't a given. There are also different levels of membership and engagement with unions across sectors. So, for example, the Primary Teachers Association has more than 50,000 members just for that one union. Early childhood workers last year secured their first ever collective agreement, which actually possibly signals that unionisation across the education sector could actually be growing.
Richard Wagstaff says unions are vital and give workers a voice in the workplace, covering everything from day-to-day issues to collective bargaining. He says they are needed now more than ever. So what are the biggest challenges?
We have an attitude to unions which is, I think, unfortunate. I think a lot of people regard unions as not something that should be easily respected or joined. A lot of, as I said, small businesses regard, not all, but many small businesses regard it as an act of insurrection if somebody wants to join a union. It doesn't need to be that way. It could be much more productive and much more welcoming of people expressing their democratic rights and being part of a wider union movement. I think we've got high unemployment, and that never goes well for union membership. People fear for their jobs. They fear if they join a union and are outspoken that maybe that will curtail their employment prospects and so forth.
And the employers, if people say, yep, I'm part of a union, do you know of employers who've gone, actually just no, we're not going to take you on?
I think that probably is the case. Nobody's going to come out and say that easily or openly. But, where we do have long-established relationships with employers, it's a very positive relationship, and employers know that one of the things that unions bring is honest feedback. The unions will tell them things that they might not want to hear or their own managers might not want to tell them, but unions can really provide a strong foundation for a much more authentic employment and management culture.
But he says unions are in a difficult legislative and political environment right now.
Immediately this government was appointed, they amended the Reserve Bank Act to make unemployment no longer a consideration for the Reserve Bank Governor in setting the cash rate. That sent a strong signal that unemployment's not a big issue, when of course from our point of view it's a massive problem, one that needs to be addressed with urgency. The removal of fair pay agreements was a very serious backtrack on some real progress we were making. And we believe that it's essential that New Zealand start developing industry standards for workers so that workers' conditions aren't undercut by competing businesses. And we've seen that sort of openly in areas like the bus industry, where companies come in and undermine existing companies by tendering on very low conditions of work because there's no industry standard. We saw the expansion of 90-day trials, where people basically effectively have no rights for 3 months from being fired. We had important Holidays Act reform on the way. That seems to have gone out the window. We've had contractor law reform. The courts ruled that organisations like Uber had employees, not contractors, and the Minister signalled that she wants to change that after meeting with Uber. She signalled she wants to undermine personal grievance rights. She signalled that she wants to address partial strike deductions, making it harder for unions to take industrial action. We've also had other ministers, such as David Seymour, remove the rights of teachers in charter schools to initiate for MECA bargaining, multi-employer agreement bargaining, which in our view is a breach of the ILO as well. The minimum wage hasn't been adjusted to keep up with inflation for the first time in a very long time, and so on. The list is very long, and our concern is, I'm trying to think of a good story, but I can't.
He says results from their recent mood of the workforce survey weren't pretty.
Their attitudes are very low. A lot of people feel very vulnerable. They feel vulnerable both at work and in their accommodation because of the no-cause evictions and so on. Optimism has gone out the window, really, and people think there's not a lot of bright spots on the horizon. All we see is higher unemployment, poor quality management, and reduced rights to bargaining. So, people aren't feeling all that positive. We know that we can push back on this, and we will. That's what we're here for. But right now it's a pretty tough time for unemployment relations for working people.
There was a time when working people every single one had to belong to a union.
In 1913, New Zealand was one of the most highly unionised countries in the world. And in 1936, the first Labour government made union membership compulsory.
It wasn't long until there were 500 unions in New Zealand. Membership grew dramatically. But then the Employment Contracts Act came into force in 1991 and unions were no longer compulsory. Numbers dropped rapidly.
These days, those who belong to unions are in the minority.
How has union membership changed over the years in New Zealand?
Well, going back a long time now, unions were, half the workforce or more were working people in unions. But once the Contracts Act came, that really put the knife to unions and membership dropped dramatically. In the last few years, union membership has stabilised. In fact, we're growing now. The latest survey, New Zealand Household Labour Force survey, said something like 490,000 workers said they were in unions, 21% of the workforce. Back in 2019, that was 413, and back in 2016, that was 384,000 people. So you can see there's steady growth going on now, and unions are finding their feet and I think finding their voice very effectively.
What are you putting that increase down to?
I think it's a few things. One is that I think there's a growing awareness amongst working people that on their own they don't have much power and much voice and much opportunity to change things. They're price takers rather than negotiators. I think also in the previous government, the legislation, things like pay equity, health and safety and so forth, it allowed us to have a stronger say in things and a greater presence. And I think the opportunity to meet with workers with fair pay agreements and so forth really boosted our presence and our opportunity to engage with working people and to attract them.
Critics argue that unions are irrelevant, they've had their day. So are unions still relevant today? Have you had your day?
We certainly are relevant today, and I think you can see that in any number of ways. When things are going against workers, and you'd have to say that it hasn't been a great time for working people over the last few decades when it comes to our share of the economy, when it comes to wages, conditions, when it comes to security of work, when it comes to unemployment and so forth. It's really important within our democratic society that we have a voice for working people. I'd say it's very relevant. Internationally right now we're seeing the likes of the tech billionaires, Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg, and they're infamous union haters, union busters.
I disagree with the idea of unions. I just don't like anything which creates kind of a lords and peasants sort of thing. And I think the unions naturally try to create negativity in a company and create a lords and peasants situation.
But we're seeing unions over there doing us proud by standing up to these incursions on workers' rights to those kinds of people.
A group of protesters in Washington, D.C. say they will return every day to protest Elon Musk.
Stop the steal! There's a robbery in progress! Stop the steal!
And I think the same goes in all countries. As there is increasingly authoritarian tendencies, we need democratic institutions like unions to fight back.
Younger people, when you speak to them, they've got, oh God, I have no idea what unions do or what they're about. How do you appeal to them, educate them, get the younger members signing up?
That's not new, really, but what we find is that as people gain experience at work, and then once they're in a workplace where there are unions, they'll, young people join as much as anybody else. What's really the biggest determinant of whether somebody joins a union is what do their workmates do. So the very same individual who's a teacher or a public servant or who works for Fonterra where there's a strong union, they'll join the union. But if they go into a workplace where there's no union, they're not likely to put up their hand to their boss in a small business and say, hey, how do I join the union? Because very often that's met with sort of a sense of betrayal by employers. They think there's something wrong if people join a union, rather than accepting it as actually a perfectly sensible and legitimate democratic right of a citizen to join a union.
To those who say, look, unions are troublemakers and they're disruptive to the workforce, what do you say to that?
Well, we are troublemakers to people like Elon Musk, that's true, and we're troublemakers to employers who don't want to share their gains, but really, if you look at, the record of unions in terms of productivity is very strong. Countries that do very well, the Scandinavian countries, the Denmarks, the Singapores and so forth, have very strong unions, much stronger than in New Zealand, higher density, much greater levels of union engagement in industry and so forth. They are doing very well. What unions do, though, are a couple of things. We expect that the gains are shared more evenly and fairly, and we also raise workers' expectations. A lot of people who don't like those things like to try and say we're not necessary, but I would argue that we're incredibly necessary, as important as we've ever been.
Solidarity forever.
which he says makes this American trade union anthem dating back 110 years still relevant today.
For the union makes us strong.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Richard Wagstaff and Alice Peacock. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Alex Harmer. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matiwa.
For the union.